Fitty replied. About 15 minutes later, as Staff Sergeant Twiddles snoozed in the passenger seat, I was doing my level best to fight off the sleep monster. You know when you're driving while tired and you start seeing movement out the corner of your eye? I was starting to get that. Truckers call them black dogs, and they mean it's time to get your ass off the road and get some sleep. I think that's why I initially dismissed him at first as a figment of my tired brain, a mere mental ghost at the side of the road.
All Vic's halt!
Fitty yelled over the radio.
I got someone on deck on our right.
That woke me up. I brought the truck to a halt, checking my rear view, making sure that the trucks behind me weren't about to slam into me, before turning my attention to the road ahead of me and the surrounding areas. I look for anything that might be a threat. When someone calls a halt to a convoy, you halt. It may save your life. Staff Sergeant Twiddles came awake too. I saw him reach up to his headset out of the corner of my eye.
Did you just stop a fucking convoy for one dumbass hitchhiking Iraqi out looking for his next goat to fuck?
Twiddles said groggily over the net.
I think he's an American or a Brit, Staff Sergeant.
Fitty said from his perch in the turret.
His gear looks like ours, and I think he's alone. I got my NVGs on and I can't see no one else. He's alone.
Staff Sergeant Twiddles looked perplexed at that. An American, much less a Brit, wouldn't be out hitchhiking Iraqi backroads at balls o'clock at night. Especially not alone. Maybe a Georgian. Those dudes are fucking wild. This was something we'd have to check out. Can't leave a brother get kidnapped and tortured to death on Al Jazeera.
Gator 1, Gator 3.
The Marine in charge of the 7-ton at the rear of the convoy came over the net.
Why we stopped? My gunner said he saw a lost country on the side of the road. Gator 2, you see anybody? Yeah, I got eyes on him. He's on the deck about halfway between my truck and yours.
Vehicle commander of the Humvee responded.
You want me to check him out? What's he doing? He's just standing there, staring out into the desert. All right, all Vics, 5s and 15s.
Staff Sergeant said over the net, which meant that he was telling the crews of the 3 trucks to conduct an inspection of the area 5 feet around the vehicles, to make sure whoever got out of their truck didn't step on a conveniently placed IED. After that, you expand your search for exploding bullshit to about 15 feet. If it looked clear, you approach the door and inspect the ground directly below you. If it looked okay, you get out.
Gator 2, driver, and TC dismount and back me up. Gator 3, let the CLC know that we found what looks like a lost coalition personnel. We're going to check him out and bring him in.
Staff Sergeant Twiddles looked over at me and nodded. I nodded back and shut down the truck. Normally the gunner and the driver stay with the truck at all times, but we were 8 guys in 3 trucks, and we didn't have dismounts, so the drivers went a-walking. You gotta do what you gotta do with what you got sometimes. I climbed down my side of the truck and walked around to Staff Sergeant Twiddles, who was busy yelling at Fitty up in the turret.
Keep your fucking eyes open. Don't let me get tagged by some fucking mud sniper because you weren't paying attention.
Fitty responded with a thumbs up, which transitioned to a middle finger as soon as the Staff Sergeant's back was turned. I rolled my eyes and turned to follow our beloved leader. It was a quiet walk, and there was a bit of tension in the air. Staff Sergeant Twiddles had his pistol out, and my rifle was at the ready as we approached the man standing on the side of the road. The Marines from Gator 2 were approaching from the opposite direction. They had their rifles up as well. They both had nerve showing in their posture, but I couldn't say I blamed them. That shit was quite frankly weird, and it had a lot of potential to go stupid at any moment. We all stopped about 30 feet from the guy, just in case he might have exploded or something silly like that. At that point in time, it was mostly peaceful in our AO, but at the end of the day, we were still at war, so best to be wary of exploding people. The night was quiet, as desert nights tend to be, with only the rumbling of Gator 3's diesel engine as it pulled a 3-point turn, so they could watch our back the way we came in the distance drifting towards us on a light breeze. I brought my rifle up and flipped on the Surefire flashlight affixed to the rails of my rifle. The sudden bright light illuminated our mysterious friend. It was weird. The guy was in American gear, all right. Just gear from 20 years ago. Dude had on old-school Marine Corps uniform, which featured a camouflage pattern known as chocolate chip. He wore a green 1980s style flak jacket which was adorned with an old school load-bearing vest. He also had an old M16A2 service rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked like a Desert Storm reenactor. One of those nerds who dropped a couple grand on era-appropriate gear, just to go out and play soldier for the weekend. Thing was, this man had a defeated air to him. He didn't look like he was about to go pretend assault some fake Republican guardsman or go pound some brewskis with the boys at TGI Fridays afterwards. He looked like somebody had just shot his puppy, arms hanging down at his sides, shoulders slumped, and head hanging low, chin on his chest. His shoulders shook slightly, and I realized he was quietly sobbing. Nobody said anything for a moment. Just watched the sobbing man who was dressed in old gear and carrying an old gun. I looked over at the Marines from Gator 2. The driver, a guy who went by the name Turbo on account of how fucking slow he was, had a concerned look on his face. His rifle was at the ready, but I was willing to bet he wasn't eager to use it. I caught his eyes and we both shared a shrug. The sobbing man was weird, but he didn't throw off a threatening vibe. Just the opposite, in fact. He'd clearly been through some shit. Hell, I almost wanted to hug the morose motherfucker.
Hey.
Staff Sergeant Twiddles called out, trying to get the sobbing man's attention. The man didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him, didn't do nothing that indicated that he knew 4 armed men were standing around him.
Hey, are you an American?
No response from the man. Twiddles took a step towards the man, as if he was about to walk up to him, but then he thought better of it. Instead, he knelt down and picked up a chunk of highway concrete the size of a Hot Wheels car. He stood back up, and before anyone could ask him why he was about to throw a rock at a man who was crying, he threw a rock at a man who was crying. The rock bounced off the man's shoulder. At first, it looked like he was about to keep ignoring us, but eventually, the sobbing man's head shifted in our direction a little. He paused like that for a moment, as if weighing out what to do next. He finally stood up straight, putting a hand on his forehead and turned around towards me and Twiddles. His anguished face had a red hue to it, like he'd been crying for a while. I noticed that besides the red face, he was paler than shit. He ran his hand across his eyes, trying to wipe away tears. It was truly a pathetic sight to behold.
They fucking left me, man.
The man gasped out between hitching breaths with tears rolling down his face. The one that said he was born and raised in one of those flyover states defined by corn and flatness.
They fucking left me.
As the words left his lips, I felt a pinprick of ice run up my spine, like someone ran the corner of an ice cube up my vertebrae. The man had a normal face, a normal voice, normal eyes. But there was something off about him. A voice in the back of my mind piped up and said, "Yeah, he ain't supposed to be here." I wasn't sure if that meant he wasn't supposed to be out here on his own, or just on this plane of existence. I was leaning towards the latter, but I didn't know why. Something told me we needed to back off of this dude and just let him be. Let him keep crying into the desert. But there was no way in hell that we could do that. Leaving an American out here by himself was the same thing as sentencing him to death.
All right, man.
Staff Sergeant Twiddles responded in what was his version of a soft tone.
We're gonna get you out of here.
The man locked eyes with Twiddles and repeated his catchphrase. They fucking left me. Twiddles looked over at me, with an expression that landed somewhere between holy shit and what the fuck. This was bad. The implication was that there was a unit out here leaving guys behind, and for some reason they were rolling around in Desert Storm gear.
What's your name, bud?
Twiddles said while taking a few more steps towards the southern man. I noticed that he hadn't holstered his pistol. He wasn't aiming it at the man, but it wasn't quite down by his side either. I shadowed along beside Twiddles. I had my rifle up and pointed in the man's direction. I told myself that it was just because I wanted to keep him illuminated with my gun light. But looking back on it, it was partially because this dude was an unknown and I wasn't fully ready to relax just because he was an ugly crier. The man ignored Twiddles, his eyes shifting away from him and looking into mine. I offhandedly noticed that he didn't try and block the light from my surefire, like the bright-ass gunlight in his eyes wasn't bothering him. I remember wondering if it was one of the effects of shock. I figured that might have been what was bothering me about him, besides everything else, I mean. I tried to reassure myself that that was in fact the problem, but I knew it wasn't. As you may or may not know, I had dealt with some pretty weird shit in my military career up until that point, and I got a feeling this was about to be some more weird shit. This was years ago, but I remember those eyes as if I'd just looked into them. They were sad, hurt, haunted even. If my buddies had left me to die in the desert, I would be pissing fire and ready to tear somebody's dick off, not having an emotional breakdown in an Indian country. Some people cope differently, I guess. Twiddles moved closer to the man and I followed. The Marines from Gator 2 mirrored us from the opposite position. The Southern man kept me in his gaze, and for some reason my mind wandered back to the little girl on the ram, the one I spoke about in my first story. I briefly entertained the notion that this was her father and he was crying because he missed her. I brushed that one out of my mind as a bit of silliness, not worthy of thought. Upon reaching the man, he broke his unnerving stare and shifted his gaze back out to the desert, looking away from me. I remember feeling a vague sense of relief that he'd broken eye contact. The man's lips were moving, and I realized he was whispering his fucking words again. He fucking left me. He fucking left me. He fucking left me. He fucking left me. Over and over again. This dude's cheese had clearly slid off his cracker. Twiddles realized that as well and motioned towards his slug rifle whilst looking at me, leaving disarming an emotionally unstable person to one of his guys and not doing the job himself. Classic Twiddles move. I know what I'd saw when I reached out to take the man's rifle. An M16A2 service rifle in good and serviceable condition. When I grabbed the rifle by the barrel and slid it off his shoulder, it changed. As soon as it broke contact with the man's body, it was like somebody had switched the rifle in my hand out for something that had just been drug out of the desert. I don't know how to explain it. One minute the thing was a fine example of an American-made Colt long gun. The next, it was a completely different pony. The handguards were brittle and sun-bleached. The metal had been stripped off of bluing and was now rusty and pitted. The carrying handle was mostly rusted away. The buttstock had a big crack in the shape of a lightning bolt. I attempted to clear it, but the magazine releasing button wouldn't budge and neither would the charging handle. The thing looked like it had been sitting outside for the last 20 years. At least the rifle was on safe. That would have to do. But shit, I felt like I need a fucking tetanus shot just from holding the damn thing. Staff Sergeant Twiddles looked over at the Marines who represented Gator 2.
I'm gonna put him in your truck, Leprechaun.
Twiddles told the Marine who was in charge of Gator 2. His nickname was Leprechaun because he was an absolutely massive walking slab of muscle masquerading as a human being.
If he starts getting out of line, you pop him one and settle him down. We'd put him in the back of Buffalo, but it's full of gear right now.
Leprechaun didn't say anything back to Twiddles. Just gave him a blank look before slowly nodding at him in the affirmative. The way Twiddles had issued his decree about the Southern man riding in the Hummer was telling. They were both valid reasons. Leprechaun would in fact be able to handle the man if he lost his shit, and the Buffalo did in fact have equipment in it. But the way the words fell out the Staff Sergeant's mouth, at a slightly quicker pace than usual, painted a clear picture of the nervous energy Twiddles was infected with. The man could have ridden in our truck, but I don't think Twiddles would have let that happen. I mean, shit. Not I would have been eager to have him sitting behind me in the truck either, but he was obviously passing the buck on this one. Twiddles tried breaking through to the Southern man one more time.
Hey, buddy. You're gonna be okay. Gonna get you back to Camp Ramadi.
The Southern man looked back at Twiddles. He didn't even say his catchphrase this time. He just gave his head a frustrated shake. Twiddles looked up at Leprechaun and told him to get the Cyberman loaded up. Leprechaun put his hand on the man's shoulder and urged him towards the Hummer. The Cyberman took one look back out at the desert. Finally, he dropped his head and turned to go with Leprechaun and Turbo. The man kept whispering his motto, "They fucking left me." I lit up a smoke as we walked back to our truck, trying to let the nicotine calm me down. Sneaking glances at the man over my shoulder, Twiddles was eager to get back on the road to Camp Ramadi. I think he was mostly pretty eager to get the Cyberman off his hands. Not to mention that it was never a good idea to spend too much time stopped in one place while outside the wire. For all we knew, Terry Taliban was dialing in on our position with his trusty mortar and trying to get his best pal, Alan Al-Qaeda, to sneak up on our position with the trusty RPG. Fuck both of them, I remember thinking. I looked down at the battered old rifle in my hand. The thing was a fucking relic, and looked every bit of one. It was still fucking with me. The fact it looked almost new on the man's shoulder, but now it looked like the gun Fred Flintstone had learned to shoot with. I told myself that was just my mind fucking with me, but I knew I was lying to myself. Because why would this guy have even been outside the wire with the rifle in such a shit shape? Hell, most of the locals would have turned their noses up at it. We mounted back up in the truck. I put the rifle on the console next to me. Twiddles didn't say much. He just waited on me to get settled in my seat before he keyed out the radio.
All Vicks, all Vicks. Roger up when you're ready to move.
Gators 2 and 3 notified us that they were ready to move. Staff Sergeant Twiddles told everyone we were stepping off and notified our CLC that we were getting back on the move with a +1, and we got back on the road to Camp Ramadi. We hadn't gone more than a mile or so before Leprechaun came over the net.
Gator 1, Gator 2.
Leprechaun's voice came booming over their headsets, starting the shit out of me, as I'd been lost in a moment of deep thought, the sort you tend to fall into on a long drive.
Gator 2, go for Gator 1. This dude's starting to freak out,
Leprechaun said over the net. I could hear the sobs of the man in the background.
He's got his hands on his head and he's damn near screaming about getting left behind. Over.
I looked at the up-armored Humvee in my side mirror. I noticed that it had been closing up and dispersion between our vehicles a little closer than I would have liked. Turbo may have been trying to make up for his general lack of speed, or he was eager to get the movement over with. I don't know which.
Roger that. If it gets too bad, we'll pull over and hog time, but I'd rather not have to do that. Roger that, Gator 1.
Leprechaun rumbled back over the radio.
We'll try it.
Leprechaun was cut off, right as the world behind me erupted with noise and violence. There was a bright flash in my rear view, and it felt like a giant kicked my truck square in the ass. I must have reflexively cranked the steering wheel or something, because the next thing I know, the ass end of the truck is whipping around and I swear I'm up on 3 wheels. Without thinking, I cranked the wheel out of the spin and managed to pull us back down on all 6. The whole truck jolted violently as I touched down. I heard something crunch, and I felt more than I heard the engine quit doing its job. The truck lurched to a stop sideways across the road. My whole body screamed in protest at the spin cycle that just been put through. Everything was fuzzy and my head was banging. Felt like I was going to vomit. Not sure how I managed to keep that big bitch with its high center of gravity from flipping the hell over. I realized I still had my boot jammed to the brake.
Gator main, Gator mobile. We just got hit bad.
I heard a voice say from far off in the weeds. I realized it was Twiddles speaking into his headset, letting the COC know that we were in a bad way. His voice was oddly calm. I looked beyond him. Out of his window, all I saw was smoke in the darkness, lit up by panels of lights from the truck. Fitter was no longer up in his turret. I knew because his head was poked out from behind us, blocking my view of the shit show outside the window. He looked over at me. I could tell he was having trouble focusing on me. "You okay, bro?"